Hi, welcome to Exploring Religion. I'm your host, Dr. Kegan Chandler, and in this episode, we're going to be introducing Shinto, a Japanese religion, or perhaps the Japanese religion, sometimes styled the indigenous religion of Japan. And this will be the first discussion that I hope to have on the Shinto tradition or the Shinto family of traditions, and one which I hope will be helpful for students who are interested in learning more about what Shinto is, or perhaps what it isn't. And today I'm going to be asking questions about ancient Shinto or Shinto in the ancient periods of Japanese history rather than focusing on what we might call Shinto in contemporary Japan, what you might see if you visited Japanese cities today and you saw the colorful torii gates or the shrines or you saw the matsuri or the festivals in the streets. I'm going to try to focus on a time before all of that, and I'll be asking fundamental questions like what is Shinto? Where does it all come from? What can we say about its practical features or its concepts? And what can we say about the relationship between earlier ancient forms of Japanese religion and what we call Shinto today? But before we can travel down this historical path, we do need to begin first with this word Shinto, and also a brief introduction to how most contemporary scholarly and popular sources have described whatever it is that this word refers to. This Japanese word Shinto is typically translated the way of kami, or the way of deities or gods. It derives from the Middle Chinese Shandao, once again, way of deities, way of gods, or perhaps even the divine way or divine path. Precisely how one translates this term is going to depend on how one interprets the Chinese character pronounced in Japanese as kami or shin or jin, or pronounced in Chinese as shen. And some scholars suggest that this Chinese term, shen dao, refers actually to a loose collection of folk religions or religious ideas from ancient China, rather than referring to a particular Chinese religious tradition. But the Japanese term Shinto definitely refers now to a specific religion of Japan. Again, one that is held to be the religion of Japan or the indigenous religion of Japan. That's the way it's described in many encyclopedias. And this is purported to be a tradition which is so ancient that it predates Japanese historical records. But we'll get into that question shortly. In terms of its features, we often read about Shinto's peculiar disposition towards nature. We read that this is a religion which emphasizes harmony between the natural world and human beings. And we also hear about something called kami, which again are described as gods or deities or spirits. And these kami, it is said, are closely associated with objects of nature. Sometimes they are described as inhabiting objects of nature like trees and mountains, rocks, waterfalls. But sometimes we get the sense that kami, in fact, are these objects. That's what kami are. They are trees and rocks and rivers, etc. Standard sources will also tend to make claims about Shinto, which would seem to immediately set it apart from so-called Western ways of doing religion or Western traditions like Christianity. For example, we will often hear that Shinto has no moral code, that it has no scriptures, that it has no founder, that it has no concept of the afterlife. Now, whether or not these common descriptions adequately capture both what this tradition has been up to in history and what it is up to today is an interesting and important question, and one that I hope to progressively address over the course of several episodes. But just to get ahead of myself a little bit, I'll warn you that I personally find some of these standard descriptions in Western sources to be grossly inadequate and even misleading. However, before we can even question common descriptions of Shinto like these. The truth is that we have perhaps a more fundamental question on our hands. And this is a question about whether or not one can even speak of Shinto as a distinct religion in the course of Japanese history. It is well known that Japanese religions have been characterized by a tendency to borrow from one another and to blend various beliefs and practices together through a process which scholars have, for better or for worse, described as syncretism. Now, scholarly controversies over the word syncretism aside, it is clear that a conscious process of incorporation has been relatively significant in Japanese religious history, as it has been in the history of Chinese religion. In China, we hear about the famed three teachings, or Sanjiao, which are held to form a harmonious unit. These are Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. There's an old saying that's often been repeated in regard to Chinese religion. It says, every Chinese wears a Confucian cap, a Taoist robe, and Buddhist sandals. And in Japan, there has been, as I said, a similar tendency towards harmonization. Um, but in the Japanese formulation of this kind of saying, Taoism has not been given a prominent role, though it is clear that there has been a strong Taoist influence in the history of Japan. But in the Japanese version of the saying, Taoism has been replaced, if you will, by Shinto. It is said that Shinto is the root of the tree, Confucianism is its trunk and branches, and Buddhism is its blossoming flower. And I'm sure that a Buddhist was responsible for this particular version of this saying. But you'll note that in this image, Shinto is described as the roots of the Japanese tree, which evidences to me at least a popular understanding that Shinto, whatever that is, it came first, that Shinto was there forming the religious consciousness of Japan prior to the importation and incorporation of foreign ideas like Confucianism and Buddhism. And incorporation certainly is the name of the game in the history of Japanese religion, where traditions and concepts like Shinbutsu Shugo or the syncretism of kami and Buddhas have been predominant, and where such systems have been supported by philosophical concepts like Honji Suijaku, which translates roughly to originals and their traces, and which explains that the Shinto kami are in fact emanations of more fundamental Buddhist deities. This integration of Shinto, or the Japanese worship of kami and Buddhist figures, this is very well known and can even still be observed at Japanese religious sites today. And I'll likely make other episodes exploring all of this at some point. But in the history of Shinto scholarship, I need to point out that historians have dealt with the idea or the possibility of a distinct and pre existing Shinto tradition in a variety of ways. Some have said that basically there is no possibility of a Shinto apart from Buddhism. And others have said that, well, Shinto is in fact a distinct religion which predates Buddhism, which precedes it in history. And this latter opinion, that Shinto is a distinct religion which predates Buddhism, this is in fact a very old idea in the history of Japanese scholarship. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, a scholarly movement emerged in Japan amongst Japanese intellectuals called Kokugaku, or literally national study. This was an ethnocentric, nationalistic academic movement which aimed to promote a distinct Japaneseness, a uniqueness and superiority of Japan over continental culture, especially that of China. And scholars in this movement studied Japanese literary classics and religious texts, and they worked very hard to remove any perceptibly foreign elements from Japanese religiosity, and they were especially interested in extracting or isolating a purely Japanese religion of Shinto as something more original to Japan prior to the introduction of Chinese religions. So, regarding the question of whether or not we can speak of Shinto as a distinct religion in the ancient periods of Japanese history, Kokugaku scholars answered absolutely yes. And it was with this historical conclusion in view that the subsequent Japanese imperial government of the 19th and 20th centuries created something that we now call state Shinto. And during this period, the Japanese government sought to elevate this state Shinto as a deeply Japanese tradition over and against Buddhism, especially as a foreign Indian religion which came to Japan from India through China and Korea. And this is something that I find is not widely known in general amongst at least the Western public. The fact that Buddhism, whose influence is everywhere in modern Japan, was at one point challenged and even harshly persecuted. Its status as a Japanese religion was contested in Japan. And though what we call Shinto and Buddhism had in truth existed in a deeply intertwined relationship for centuries, the Japanese government had tried to formally separate the two, promoting an idea called Haibutsu Kishaku, or literally abolish Buddhism and destroy Shakyamuni, referring to Shakyamuni Buddha, that is, the Buddha of Indian tradition. Now, Buddhism eventually recovered, of course, obviously. But my point in bringing all of this up is the fact that the early modern scholarship, which formed something of the basis for the actions of the Japanese government in this period, is perhaps an extreme example of the kind of scholarship which is conceived of Shinto as a distinct and more originally Japanese tradition. So much so that Buddhism could evidently be carved away and set aside, or perhaps burned to the ground in this case, as was the situation of many Buddhist temples across Japan. And the belief from this perspective is that we can strip all of that Buddhist artifice away, and something called Shinto could nevertheless remain intact. Now, more recent Japanese scholarship has been highly critical of this earlier perspective that I've just described. And perhaps the most famous example of this is Kuroda Toshio, who is a very famous Japanese scholar who died in 1993. And it was his view that essentially Shinto was a creation of this nationalistic political movement to separate Japan from its East Asian rivals. Kuroda insisted that Shinto cannot genuinely be described as the indigenous religion of Japan. And he held that it had been essentially indistinguishable from Buddhism since ancient times. For example, according to this view, any philosophical doctrines which might be detected in what we call Shinto are actually Buddhist in origin. Some scholars have even gone so far as to say that if one were to extract all of the Buddhist elements from Shinto that it has accumulated in its history, then there would really be nothing left. However, I do need to point out that according to Kuroda, something called Shinto can be traced to the Middle Ages of Japanese history. But he describes this itself as an offshoot of Buddhism, if I understand him correctly. And later, it is this Buddhist offshoot that was taken hold of by political forces and developed into Shinto. Kuroda does have some other noteworthy views on Buddhism that I won't go into here. But the bottom line is that Kuroda's work has been significant in shaping both contemporary Japanese and Western scholarship on Shinto in the last several decades. And I think most scholars today would agree, more or less, that we should not really speak of an independent Shinto prior to the Meiji period government edict to separate the Buddhas from the Shinto kami. I think that's probably a predominant opinion. But since Kuroda's passing in 1993, there has been a new scholarship which has been heavily influenced by Kuroda, but one which has started to push the existence of an independent Shinto back further into Japanese history. One new camp among contemporary scholars like John Breen, Fabio Rambelli, or Inoue Hiroshi seems to argue that we should identify the origins of Shinto in Japan's medieval period and in the organizational efforts of dominant figures like Yoshida Kanetomo, who lived from 1435 to 1511. And scholars of this persuasion seem to argue that this is where the word Shinto really comes to be applied to a carefully structured systems of shrines and rituals and liturgy, which had been formally integrated with the imperial government. However, other scholars, for example, Helen Hardacre and Inoue Nobutaka, Ito Satoshi, Indo Jun, and others, these scholars have pushed instead to recognize an institutional beginning for Shinto as early as the 8th century, um, pointing especially to the government's institution of the Jingikan, which was an official office which governed shrine affairs all across Japan. So we have a few camps which have formed on this subject, and yet I suggest we can continue to ask whether Shinto can be pushed back even further than this into history. Can we detect something identifiable as Shinto in Japan's even more ancient periods prior to the late 7th and early 8th centuries? It's, of course, reasonable, I think, to assume that something religious existed among the ancient peoples of the Japanese islands prior to contact with China and Korea. No scholars think there was absolutely no religious activity in Japan prior to the introduction of Buddhism or Confucianism. When contemporary scholars say that Shinto is not the indigenous religion of Japan, I find that they typically mean that Shinto as we know it cannot be found in the earliest periods. What is found there, they suggest, are loose or scattered or disorganized shrines or ritual sites involving kami, that is, spirits or deities. So the question then becomes, is this Shinto, this loose pattern, if you will, of kami veneration? And I think that where one ultimately ends up on this question about the existence of Shinto in history will largely be governed by one's definition of religion and how large a role the concept of institution or organization, as distinct from individual belief, plays in that definition. And also, what you think about how human institutions and human ideas develop over time, that may also play a role. Someone may look at early kami worship and discover something like an embryonic Shinto, or perhaps the seeds of Shinto, which later grew and developed into what we call Shinto today. In other words, someone may be imagining a core organism with a set of fundamental features and an organism which has moved throughout time with those fundamental features intact. But nevertheless, there have been various appendages which have been developed, perhaps in response to its environment. For example, the introduction of Buddhism and Confucianism. On the other hand, others may look at this early kami worship and they may recognize something very different from later Shinto. You might imagine that religions don't actually evolve or grow. Instead, you might insist that religions have a certain set of features which are actually replaced over time, in effect, creating a new religion which overlaps closely with the constituent characteristics of the religion which came before it, but which is in fact a distinct religion. This sort of idea, I think, might be assumed by those who are interested in emphasizing specific moments in time, specific moments in Japanese history in which there emerged deliberate or widespread organization. Um, what these organizational actions might represent are, in fact, replacements of earlier features of a religion with new ones. In this case, going from less organization to more organization, which would ultimately produce, in this kind of perspective, a new religion. So, if the institutionalization of religions is prioritized, then we might recognize, in fact, a whole family of Shintos, uh, each of which, though they have many features in common, cannot ultimately be said to represent a single persistent tradition through time. Now, in this episode, I won't be asking you to think of Shinto or the development and persistence of religions in one way or the other. However, I will be asking you to at least keep these fundamental questions in mind as you develop your own ideas and as you explore how the historical study of religions, how the historical study of Shinto ends up being the most fertile ground or some of the most fertile ground for thinking about the nature of religions. And perhaps even thinking about philosophical questions about the persistence of identity over time. But ultimately, this is a critical way of thinking about the development of religions, which I think can be helpful for those engaging religions from a theological perspective as well. When religions or religious organizations or people claim that their tradition is not new, for example, that it can actually be traced back to ancient times or perhaps to this or that historical figure or movement. On this channel, I want to introduce you to a way of thinking about these claims um, and a way of asking questions about on what criteria we should judge claims made by religions. For those of you who might imagine that religions as things which evolve or grow over time, we should ask how much change is acceptable before we disqualify religious claims to continuity with the past. On the other hand, for those who might prioritize the emergence of a particular organization or a particular set of doctrines or rituals, what do we do about the objective overlap between this religion and all of the religious phenomena that came before it? How much overlap with the past do religions need to maintain? And what do we do with the subjective claims of participants in those religions that they are not, in fact, doing anything new at all? These are a set of challenging questions, which I think are especially energized by a study of ancient Shinto origins. And these are some of the haunting questions that we're going to continue to think about as we look for something called Shinto in the ancient history of Japan. And we're going to do that in our next episode and perhaps for a few more episodes. The next discussion, I'm going to pick up specifically in the ancient Jomon and Yayoi periods, very ancient periods in Japan's remote history. But until then, I'm Dr. Kegan Chandler, and I want to thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to the channel if it interests you and you'd like to support it. And we'll see you next time on Exploring Religion. Thanks so much.